Good afternoon, and we're happy to see you here with us for this program that we've been preparing for some time, presented by Sojourners, the Commission on Social Justice, and the Taskforce on Antiracism. We will continue this series for the next 3 Sundays, beginning at 1:30 and ending at 3 p.m. So we are pleased and happy that you are joining us. For this session, my name is Emily Anderson, and I will be co-facilitating this session with Francis Cannell. So again, we're so pleased that you're all with us, and we hope that we will all benefit from this experience. So thank you. Next slide. The images on this slide is an attempt to portray the racial history of voluntary immigration to the United States. In 1790, the Nationality Act was passed by Congress, which limited the right to citizenship to free white persons. In actuality, only free white male property owners could attain citizenship in the United States initially. And as we see these images, the colors and the racial makeup changes over time in terms of who the voluntary immigrants to this country are. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sitting here in my apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I have fairly recently come to understand that this is Lenape land. Like me, many of you may have been told the outrageous lie that the Lenape sold Manhattan for $24. Here is the truth. For most of us meeting in the area of New York City, we are living on Lenape-Hoking, to this day, unceded traditional territory of the Lenape, and we are bound with them in a complex history, a shared geography, and an appreciation of this land. Each week during this course, we will give acknowledgement to the original people who occupied this land for many centuries. The Lenape were sustainable farmers. Their way of life revolved around farming and relocating their villages within the range every year and returning to previous sites when the land had rejuvenated itself. They had no concept of private land ownership, therefore they would never have sold their land. The Lenape people live among us. They are major communities located in Oklahoma, Ontario, Canada, Wisconsin, and members still living around the New York City, New Jersey area. We acknowledge the Lenape people with gratitude. We present this series from the perspective of the Judeo-Christian philosophy of welcoming the stranger. And I'm going to read this scriptural text to start us off. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatsoever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Matthew 25. Next slide. Now, Craig sent this information out to you, and I'm hoping that you were able to read it. And I will just give a couple of highlights from this slide, which is our class covenant. We agree and covenant to enter the space with curiosity and humility. We agree to be brief as possible in our comments and to allow for sharing time equitably, using the acronym WAIT. Why am I talking? To be intentional in listening actively and not interrupting others or engaging in crosstalk, and make space for each other. To honor the opinions of others we disagree with as valid and sincere, allowing for honesty and safety, and to speak personally using I statements. Next slide. So our focus for today's session will be basically to debunk the myth of an open American society and the myth of the melting pot. We will discuss several agencies who are responsible for enforcement, for example, the immigration, ICE, better known as ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Customs and Border Patrol Agency. We will talk about the response at the southern border and the issues around building a border which endangers lives, breaks international laws, and wastes our taxpayer dollars. We will discuss how undocumented immigrants are trapped without a way to really acquire legal status.
Okay.
Slide, and Francis will take us.
All right. So the history of demonizing immigrants in this country is pretty long. We have also a long history of separating families. As the author Elizabeth Cohen explains, we have much more often than greeting these individuals with open arms, we have treated them with violence, cruelty, and exploitation, and a closed door. So the dynamic, as you can see by these little bubbles here, is basically you have an individual or a group of people who belong to the so-called natives, these being the white folks. They focus on othering and they demonize immigrants. And in order to make sure that they continue to have their strength and their power and their say, these individuals then demonize immigrants in the name of national security. As soon as you characterize these immigrants as national security threats, policies can be instituted to allow regressive leaders and their followers to amass power beyond what the law and the Constitution would otherwise permit, as well as what international covenants. And as a result, you create and maintain a narrative of entitlement. And I'm quoting here from Dr. Hayes. You create and maintain a narrative of entitlement, you encourage vigilantism, you entice other subordinates to carry out their sexist, racist, xenophobic agendas, and you act on the very phobias that they have created with minimal accountability or consequences to themselves. This ends up turning people against each other. It normalizes the bogus beliefs, and it enables, at least temporarily, and we hope not for much longer, those in power to maintain their hold on vast populations. Next slide. So from the very foundations of US society, we have excluded people. We know about the heinous history of slavery, of separating families, of breaking up families, of using African-American women as breeders to be labor. We also know that we have disenfranchised the natives of this country, the indigenous peoples. We've taken away their land and their culture violently with our notion of manifest destiny and of endless frontiers. We've also forced tribes onto reservations, this particularly with one of Trump's favorite presidents, starting in the early 1800s with Andrew Jackson. And then later in that same century, we began to put Native American children into reservation schools and force them away from their families and their culture and tried to make sure that they did not hold on to that. More recently, there in the 60s, in the 80s and 90s, in what was supposed to be in the name of welfare reform, we began to remove disproportionate numbers of African-American children from their birth parents. And of course, this was, and put them in foster care. And this, of course, was going on at the same time that we were accelerating the number of incarcerated people of color. Next slide, please. So then there were other groups that we deliberately excluded from other countries. Of course, the Chinese, and all of this will be discussed in great detail in the next 2 sessions, but just very briefly, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act. After we had used them to build our highways, our railroads, we decided we didn't want anymore. Mexicans and Caribbean workers were brought in, sent out, massacred, rounded up, brought in, sent out. This has been a pattern for the last century in particular. The 1924 Nationalist Origin Act law, basically quantitatively discriminated against all but Northern Europeans by its quotas. And then in the 1940s, we rounded up and disenfranchised and put in detention camps the Japanese Americans, and we closed our doors to Jews who fleeing Nazi Germany. More recently, we are plagued with the reality that we turned away Muslims with the Muslim travel ban, that we put immigrant children in cages and separated from their parents with some 1,200 still unaccounted for. We closed the border to all asylum seekers and created the stay in Mexico mandate, which basically has put people in dangerous position and denying them a basic right. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of the myths. The first is that immigrants take jobs from Americans. This is just not true. Basically, they enhance American jobs. They stabilize wages. They fill jobs that citizens, because of their age or education, will or cannot take. They also are, disproportionate number of them start their own businesses, become self-employed. They continue to get lower wages than native-born peoples. Immigrants actually work in tandem, in a kind of complementing of native-born workers by filling those gaps between the expanding low-skilled jobs and the shrinking pool of natives-born. Unfortunately, this keeps them in a category where they are underpaid and underrepresented. But we see immigrant workers, new immigrant workers, specifically in retail and agriculture, in hospitality, construction, landscaping, maintenance. This allows middle-class jobs in management, design and engineering, bookkeeping, et cetera, to be held by others, by other groups, by US citizens. And of course, our dream is that anybody starting out at that level, the so-called low skill jobs, would have the option to move into more managerial and better paying positions. And they also, of course, since we've noticed so well during this pandemic, these are the individuals who take care of our children, our elderly, our disabled, and in fact, free up other people to be able to work. So I think that next slide, and we'll go back to Emily. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Let's go back one more time. I forgot someone. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm rushing myself and forgetting the obvious. So the other, of course, is that these people coming are terrorists or criminals. This is completely wrong because there's a much lower rate of crime in areas where immigrants have been settled. In addition, they have a much lower rate of crime than native-born. And furthermore, those who are put in detention generally have absolutely no criminal record, and their only minor offense might often be a traffic violation. So there's absolutely no correlation between increases in the level of immigration or in the crime rates. The fourth point is that the hordes are overrating the country. Again, just not true, despite this hysteria voiced by the media and by current and previous administrations. There are no hordes of immigrants coming. Since 2007, in fact, there have been fewer immigrants by something like 13% coming into the country. And finally, the rationale for all this, and we'll get into this when we talk about ICE and customs and border protection, there's this notion that the government needs to beef up and speed up more and spend more on immigration laws. In fact, these agencies themselves testify to the fact that the number of non-deportable people it takes into custody vastly outstrips the number of deportable people it holds. So far from needing further enforcement, we need to cut back on that enforcement. All right, now, Emily, thank you.
Okay. So, immigrants or foreign-born are the terms that we utilize to refer to persons with no U.S. citizenship at birth. This population includes naturalized citizens, lawful permanent residents, what we used to refer to as green card holders. I think the cards are now blue. Refugees, asylees, persons who are on temporary visas, and the unauthorized or the undocumented. As of 2018, there were approximately 44.7 million foreign-born immigrants in the United States. Mexican-born individuals represented 25%, and this number has decreased, and it is continuing to decrease as Francis alluded to this. After Mexicans, the top 10 of the overall immigrant population, which represents 57% of all immigrants, include Indians from the continent, Chinese, Filipinos, and many people fleeing from countries where the United States has had political influence, people from El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, Dominican Republic. There are instances where the United States basically puts in place immigration policies designed to beef up or increase the American labor market. For example, I don't know if you recall, but there was a shortage of nurses in the United States in the 1960s and again in the 1990s. And many Filipino nurses from other places came to fill those needs. They utilized what the Immigration Department refers to as H-1 visas. And these are individuals who come, like I said, to fill those positions that are not able to be filled by Americans. 1 in 6 nurses is an immigrant in the United States today. 1 in 4 physicians is an immigrant. And a lot of this preference system has been criticized because it has led to what is called a brain drain in many of these other countries where the highly skilled are basically recruited to come to the United States to fill our labor market needs. In terms of the undocumented, and you hear a lot about the undocumented or the unauthorized, and the numbers fluctuate between 10.5 to 11 million persons. Many of them become undocumented because they overstay. They enter legally, but they overstay their visas, and they fall into the category of becoming undocumented. Next slide. Another category of immigrants is the refugee population. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees defines those persons who are fleeing from conflict and persecution as refugees. And they estimate that there are about 26 million refugees around the world. If you look at the list here, we know that the largest number on this chart is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that is explained by the fact that since, 2006, there have been tremendous upheavals, warfare, and this has led to this displacement of many, many people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Millions more have fled because of similar kinds of things in Central African Republic, Chad, El Salvador, Honduras, and of course we know what's been happening recently in Venezuela, and even more recently in Ethiopia, where there is conflict going on, and this leads to persons fleeing, and they become refugees because of that. Now, when President Obama's administration was in power, they made a pledge that they would try to resettle as many refugees as they could. He pledged to resettle 110,000 in 2017, but of course, you know, by that time, Donald Trump was in power and he was definitely not going to honor that. And he has reduced the cap for refugees down to 30,000, and now it's down to only 15,000. Those refugees who are accepted into the United States settle in the state of Texas, Washington, New York, and California. And that accounts for about 25% of those settled. And smaller proportions are settled in other parts of the country. But because of the Trump administration policies, many of these people are in limbo. They have no way of really trying to get their cases heard. And it's a problem worldwide. And the United States had been the leader, but not anymore. Now Canada leads the world in refugee resettlement.
Okay, next slide. So we come to the real enemy, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, and the Customs and Border Protection, known as CBP of Homeland Security. And we're going to do a quick visual, but just before that, I'd really encourage you to get more depth on this by looking at the Netflix series. It's 6 hours, but it's quite gripping, called Immigrant Nation. So a little bit more specific on that. And again, that's a very rough introduction, just for the purpose of the visual. We're talking about rogue agencies with immunity from laws and court rulings that regulate governmental and police activities in every other sphere. Their armed police presence and military-style fortification pose a threat to the rule of law, liberty, and the security of not just non-citizens, but to all of us. They are able to justify their every move by declaring themselves exceptional, by their exceptionalism. This expanding and unrestrained powers and jurisdiction allow these agencies to patrol and take action anywhere within 100 miles into the interior of the United States. This accounts for 2/3 of the US population, where 2/3 of the US population live. Further, the ballooning budgets are scandalous. In 2020, ICE and CBP had ICE had a budget of 20 billion, with a staff of 20,000 for ICE and 60,000 total for Customs and Border Protection. This comes down to about $6.5 million a day spent on detention, while the scandalous detaining of children is about an $18 billion industry. They have absolutely no oversight or accountability. Between 2010 and 2016, just to pull out some statistics, there were 36,000, and this is an undercut, complaints of assault, sexual molestation, abuse, for those that were put in custody in ICE facilities. And most of these, you could count on your hands and toes the numbers that were never pursued, were never brought to justice. Individuals employed within these agencies are very poorly vetted, or receive almost no training, and are rarely professional. The CPB officers are 5 times more likely than other law enforcement officers to have arrest records. They exist in a toxic culture of active racism, collaboration with paramilitary organizations, with Aryan power ideology, and with anti-government citizen militias. The further militarization and new deployments, as we saw in the reaction to the peaceful demonstrations at the White House and in Oregon last year in the summer, we see them being called in basic civic situations, and using grenades, flashbangs, chemical agencies, M4 assault rifles, and who knows what else. So this results into a further dehumanization and a blurring of the legal distinction of non-citizens, those asylum seekers, undocumented workers, legal immigrants, and all US citizens. And finally, as of July 2020, the job of interviewing the asylum seekers at the border for what is called the crucial credible fear interview, which allows them then to proceed to apply for asylum, has been taken over, or has been allocated rather, to these same rogue individuals at the border, at the CBP facilities. And these immigrants are brought in basically straight off the road where they've been immigrating, where they've been walking, where they've been trying to survive, with no access to lawyers or telephones, or even the right of a bed or a shower or cleaning facilities. And the people making the judgment for them at that point, as of July 2020, are individuals whose main purpose as employees is to deport. So next slide, please. So how many immigrant detention centers are there? Well, that quick graphic told us there are over 200, but there are really over 1,200 facilities in the United States, which are, you skipped a slide. Did we skip a slide?
I'm sorry. And also this, you're at your halfway point. You go about another 15 minutes. So I've got the stats. Is that the one you want? And then the next
No, I want the one before that.
Who's,
yeah, who's detained? No, go back. I want detention and deported. Yeah. Anyway, I'll just talk. We don't have to see it. Yeah. So again, there are over 200 official ICE facilities for immigrant detainees, but there are all over 1,200 other facilities that are temporary holding facilities. These could be hotels, they could be jails, what have you. The largest states, the states with the largest number of detention centers are Texas, with about 14,500 people in detention, and then the Arizona, Louisiana, California with about 4,000, close to 4,500 each, and then Georgia. And the people who are, these people are detained, 70 to 73% of them is what are called for-profit prisons. Who profits from this? Well, this is a $4 billion a year US industry. And there are two large groups, Geo Group and Corrections Corporation of America, or CoreCivic, which receive millions in grants each year and also put into our political system in order to lobby for themselves to expand and continue to be profitable. Many, many millions of dollars. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So who is detained and for how long? Again, these are asylum seekers. They're undocumented workers who have been in these states for a long time. Are there individuals who have some issue with their visa? It may well have expired. They're swooped up and taken and treated like criminals. The largest group are aged 26 to 35, but there has been in the last 4 years a growing number of grandfathers who are in this detention system. They can be kept for an average of 2 years or more. I'm working now with an individual from Jamaica who was in detention for 3 years. Or they can be detained and released the same day or week without due process or hearing. The average population in 1994 of these detained immigrants was about 7,000. In 2019, it was 50,000. And over the course of a year, the detention system captures and holds as many as 500,000 immigrants. Next slide, please. So one of our responses to what has been defined as a crisis has been to build a wall, which wastes lives, breaks international law, and wastes our tax money. The wall encourages criminal cartels because people are desperate to get to this country, and there is an incredibly sophisticated organization of smugglers. And we call them smugglers, but they are professionals. And the fewer places of legalized entry, the more these immigrants who are paying, who are fleeced by the smugglers, the chapulines, they have to look for indirect ways to enter the country. And they go through areas that are unsurvivable in the desert. The Sonoma Desert is the death sentence. There's also no evidence of any terrorists entering. As we know all too sadly, terrorists in this country are homegrown. This also ignores, this notion of a wall also ignores the fact that we have immigrants coming from all over the world seeking asylum. They come by air, they come by ship. Many are with the Central Americans at the border, but the wall does not stop anybody. And finally, the price of this, estimated $21 billion to build this wall. And that's about $6.5 million per mile. It is built through private property, which the government just takes. It goes over traditional indigenous lands. It goes through natural reserves. It crisscrosses arid desert and winding rivers. The border is 1,933 miles long. So you can only imagine the challenge of doing it and the total waste. And finally, walls do not stop people. Again, in terms of international law violation, we are signers of the International Human Rights Law, which has the principle of non-refoulement, which guarantees that no one should be returned to a country where they would face torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, or punishment, or other irreparable harm. So we slap these people in the face and send them off. Finally, there's the fourth thing is the trap. There really is no, and again, this will be elaborated on much more in future classes, but there really is no path for legal citizenship for those who are undocumented. There was something called the Registry Act, which allowed individuals and was updated in terms of when they had entered for decades. But after January 1st, 1972, this was not updated. And if you came in any time after that, you could not regulate your status in the way that it had been possible to do it before. There's also this myth that if you're pregnant and you come here and you bear a child, the so-called anchor baby, that you're going to be able to stay. No. Although by the 14th Amendment, children born on US soil are automatically citizens, their parents, and this is some 6 million without documentation, are not protected. And finally, there's DACA, which was instituted by Obama in 2014, but has been challenged and held up in implementation, despite court rulings validating it. It was set up to allow individuals brought here as children and adhering to certain very specific civic and educational standards to begin the path to legal citizenship.